Texas, 1847. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty town square as Marcus Thornfield rode into Clearwater Creek. He had come to watch the slave auction, nothing more. A successful rancher needed workers, and the spring cattle drive was approaching fast. But when they pulled the burlap sack from the young woman's head, revealing a face he thought was lost forever, his world shattered. The coffee cup slipped from his trembling hands, and without a thought for the crowd around him, he dropped to his knees in the Texas dirt. The town of Clearwater Creek buzzed with the usual auction day excitement. Merchants hawked their wares from wooden carts, children darted between the legs of adults, and the smell of fresh bread mixed with dust and horse sweat filled the air. Marcus had arrived early, tying his stallion to the hitching post outside Murphy's saloon. He was a man of 32 years, weathered by sun and hard work, with calloused hands. That spoke of honest labor on his sprawling ranch just outside town. He had built his spread from nothing, starting with a handful of cattle and a dream. Now the Thornfield Ranch stretched across 3,000 acres of prime Texas grassland. But success had come at a cost. The loneliness of the frontier. Life weighed heavy on his shoulders, and lately he found himself thinking more and more about the past he had left behind in Mississippi. The auction block stood in the center of the square, a wooden platform worn smooth by countless boots and weathered by years of Texas sun. A small crowd had already gathered, mostly ranchers and farmers looking to add to their workforce. Marcus recognized most of the faces. Old Ben Fletcher from the general store, the widow Morrison who ran the boarding house, and several of his neighboring ranchers. "Morning, Marcus," called out Tom Bradley, a fellow cattleman who spread bordered Marcus property to the north. "You looking to buy today?" Marcus nodded, adjusting his hat against the climbing sun. "Spring roundup's coming fast. Could use an extra pair of hands." The auctioneer, a thin man named Silas Crenshaw, began setting up his podium. He was known throughout the territory for his booming voice and quick wit, traits that served him well in his profession. Behind him, a line of people waited in the shade of a large oak tree, their futures about to be decided by the highest bidder. Marcus had attended these auctions before, though he never felt comfortable with the business. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he treated his workers fairly, paying wages when he could and ensuring they had decent quarters and food. But the economics of ranching in 1847 Texas often demanded difficult choices, and a man had to be practical to survive. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew larger. Dust kicked up by horses and wagons created a hazy atmosphere, and the temperature continued to rise. Marcus found himself a spot near the back, close enough to see clearly, but far enough away to avoid the press of bodies. The first several lots were unremarkable. Field hands, house servants, and craftsmen. The bidding was spirited, but not particularly high, as these were mostly local sales between neighbors. Marcus watched with detached interest, his mind already calculating what he might need to spend. Then Crenshaw called for the next lot. T number 7, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the square. Young woman approximately 20 years of age, trained in household duties, cooking and sewing, comes with papers of good health and temperament. Two men led a figure onto the platform. She was small in stature, wearing a simple brown dress that had seen better days. A coarse burlap sack covered her head completely, tied at the neck with rough rope. It was a common practice meant to prevent bidders from being swayed by emotion rather than practicality. Marcus felt his coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the proceedings. Something about the woman's posture, the way she held herself despite her circumstances, stirred a memory he had tried hard to bury. "Now, gentlemen," Crenshaw continued, "this here is a fine specimen, young, healthy, and Well-trained, perfect for any household that needs reliable help. Shall we start the bidding at $50? Several hands went up immediately. Marcus recognized the bidders, men who ran large operations and could afford such prices. The bidding climbed quickly. $60, $70, $80. Do I hear 90? Crenshaw called out. At $95. The bidding slowed. Only two men remained active. Walter Grimby, who owned the largest plantation in the county, and a stranger Marcus didn't recognize. Going once at 95, Crenshaw announced. Going twice. $100, came a voice from the crowd. Marcus looked around to see who had made the bid, then realized with shock that the voice had been his own. He hadn't even been aware of raising his hand. Crenshaw's eyes lit up at the unexpected bid. 100 from Mr. Thornfield. Do I hear 105? Grimby shook his head and stepped back. The stranger hesitated, then also withdrew. Marcus found himself the winning bidder, though he couldn't quite understand how it had happened. Sold to Marcus Thornfield for $100, Crenshaw declared. Sir, if you'll step forward to complete the transaction. Marcus moved through the crowd as if in a dream. $100 was more than he had planned to spend, more than he could really afford, but something had compelled him to bid. Some instinct. He couldn't explain. As he approached the platform, Crenshaw was preparing to remove the sack for the final verification of the sale. This was standard procedure. The buyer had a right to see what he was purchasing before the money changed hands. Let's have a look at your new acquisition, Mr. Thornfield, Crenshaw said with a grin. The auctioneer reached for the rope at the woman's neck. Marcus watched, still not understanding why his heart was pounding so hard. The sack came away with a quick motion. Long auburn hair tumbled free, catching the morning sunlight like spun copper. The woman raised her head slowly, revealing features that Marcus had seen every night in his dreams for the past 12 years. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes the color of spring grass that had once looked at him with love instead of the resignation he saw now. Elizabeth, he whispered. The coffee cup slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering on the hard-packed earth. His knees buckled and he found himself kneeling in the Texas dirt, staring up at the woman he had thought was dead. Elizabeth Hartwell, the plantation owner's daughter, who had captured his heart when he was nothing but a young overseer's son, the woman who had promised to wait for him while he went west to make his fortune. The woman whose father had told him she had died of fever while he was away. She was looking at him now with a mixture of shock and something else. Hurt perhaps, or betrayal. Her lips moved silently, forming his name. The crowd around them murmured with confusion and curiosity. This was clearly not the usual reaction of a buyer to his purchase. Mr. Thornfield. Crenshaw's voice seemed to come from very far away. Sir, are you all right? Marcus struggled to his feet, his mind reeling. How is this possible? How had Elizabeth ended up here on an auction block in Texas when he had mourned her death for over a decade? Yes, he managed to say. The sale is final. I'll pay you now. His hands shook as he counted out the money. Gold coins that clinked together with unusual loudness in the sudden quiet of the square. Elizabeth stood motionless on the platform, her eyes never leaving his face. The transaction completed. Marcus found himself responsible for Elizabeth's immediate care. The crowd was beginning to disperse, moving on to other business, but he could feel their curious stares and hear their whispered conversations. Come, he said quietly, extending his hand to help her down from the platform. She hesitated for a moment, then accepted his assistance. Her touch was exactly as he remembered, soft, warm, real, not the ghost his dreams had conjured, but flesh and blood. They walked in silence to where His horse was tethered. Marcus untied the reins with careful deliberation, using the time to try to collect his scattered thoughts. Elizabeth stood nearby, waiting. "The wagon," he said. "Finally. I should have brought the wagon." It was a practical concern, but also an excuse to delay the conversation they would have to have. He couldn't very well expect her to ride double with him all the way to his ranch, not in her current state, and certainly not with the entire town watching. "I can ride," Elizabeth said. Her voice was different than he remembered. Older, more careful. "If you have a spare horse," Marcus nodded toward the livery stable. "We'll rent one. For today. Tomorrow he trailed off, realizing he had no idea what tomorrow would bring. At the livery, old Pete Johnson provided a gentle mare suitable for a lady, though he eyed Elizabeth with obvious curiosity. Marcus paid the rental fee and helped her mount, his hands remembering the familiar motion of assisting her onto horseback from their younger days. The ride to his ranch took almost an hour, and they spent it in complete silence. Marcus found himself stealing glances at Elizabeth, still not quite believing she was real. She sat her horse well despite whatever hardships she had endured. Her posture was straight, her hands steady on the reins. The Thornfield Ranch spread before them as they crested the final hill. Marcus had built it to be both functional and beautiful, with a large main house surrounded by outbuildings and corral. Cattle dotted the pastures, and the whole scene spoke of prosperity and careful management. "You've done well for yourself," Elizabeth said, breaking the long silence. "I suppose I have," Marcus replied. "Though none of it means much now." They dismounted at the main house, a two-story structure built from local stone and timber. Marcus had designed it himself with wide porches and large windows to catch the prevailing breezes. It was a far cry from the grand plantation houses of Mississippi, but it was solid and comfortable. "Maria," Marcus called out as they entered the front hall. A middle-aged Mexican woman appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She had worked for Marcus for several years, managing his household with quiet efficiency. "Señor Marcus," she said, then stopped when she saw Elizabeth. "Maria, this is Elizabeth. She'll be staying with us. Could you prepare the guest room?" Maria nodded, though her eyes showed curiosity. "See, señor, right away." When they were alone in the main room, Marcus gestured toward a chair near the fireplace. Elizabeth sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap. Marcus remained standing, too agitated to sit still. "I thought you were dead," he said finally. Elizabeth looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting pain he couldn't begin to understand. "No. Your father told me you had died of fever. He showed me your grave." "My father," Elizabeth said quietly, "told many lies." The simple statement hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Marcus felt his anger building, not at Elizabeth, but at the man who had deceived them both. "Tell me what happened," he said. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, staring into the cold fireplace. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "After you left for Texas, I waited, just as I promised. I wrote letters, though. I suspect now that father intercepted them. When months passed without word from you, I began to worry. Then one day, father told me you had written to say you weren't coming back, that you had found someone else." Marcus felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "I never wrote such a letter. I wrote to you every week for the first year." "I know that now," Elizabeth said. "But then I believed him. I was heartbroken. But I believed him." She stood and walked to the window looking out at the ranch lands. "When I turned 18, father arranged a marriage for me to a man named Garrett, who owned a neighboring plantation. I didn't want to marry him, but I had no choice. No money, no prospects, and nowhere to go. Marcus watched her silhouette against the window, remembering the spirited girl who had once defied convention to meet him in secret. What happened to your husband? Garrett died 3 years ago. Gambling debts. The plantation was sold to pay his creditors and She turned back to face him. I had nothing. No family. Father died the year before. No friends who would help a widow with no money. I ended up in New Orleans trying to find work. The story was becoming clearer and Marcus felt sick at the implications. How did you end up in Texas? Elizabeth's composure finally cracked. Tears began to flow down her cheeks as she sank back into the chair. I was working as a seamstress, barely earning enough to survive. Then I got sick. Really sick. I couldn't work, couldn't pay rent. When I recovered, I owed money I couldn't repay. The man I owed, he had other ideas about how I could settle my debt. Marcus closed his eyes, not wanting to hear, but knowing he had to. I refused, Elizabeth continued. So, he sold my debt to someone else. Someone who specialized in acquiring people for the Western markets. I've been traveling for months from one auction to another. Today was supposed to be the last stop. The weight of her words settled over Marcus like a physical burden. While he had been building his dream ranch, Elizabeth had been living a nightmare. While he had mourned her death, she had been fighting for survival in a world that showed no mercy to women without protection. I'm sorry, he said, though the words felt completely inadequate. You couldn't have known, Elizabeth replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I should have tried harder to reach you. I should have come back to check on you. Why didn't you? The question was fair, and Marcus had asked it of himself many times over the years. Pride, I suppose. When your father told me you were dead, when he showed me that grave with your name on it, I thought there was nothing left for me in Mississippi. I threw myself into building this place trying to forget. And did you forget? Marcus looked at her, seeing the vulnerability beneath her carefully controlled exterior. No, I never forgot. Not for a single day. They sat in silence as the implications of their reunion settled over them. 12 years had passed. They were different people now, shaped by experiences that had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. What happens now? Elizabeth asked. It was a question Marcus had been dreading. Legally, he had purchased her. Morally, the situation was far more complex. What do you want to happen? I want to go back 12 years and make different choices, Elizabeth said with a bitter laugh. But since that's not possible, you're free, Marcus said firmly. I bought you to free you. You can stay here as long as you like, or I can give you money to go wherever you want. The choice is yours. Elizabeth studied his face carefully. And if I choose to stay, then you stay as a free woman, as a guest in my home, for as long as you want. The afternoon shadows were growing longer. When Maria announced that dinner was ready, they ate in the dining room. A meal of beef stew and fresh bread that would normally have been exactly to Marcus' taste. But he barely noticed the food, too aware of Elizabeth sitting across from him. You never married, Elizabeth observed, noting the lack of feminine touches in the house. No, Marcus said. I came close once about 5 years ago, a rancher's daughter from Austin. But it didn't work out. Why not? Marcus considered the question. I suppose because she wasn't you. The honesty of the statement surprised them both. Elizabeth set down her fork and looked at him directly. Marcus, we can't just pick up where we left off. Too much has happened. We're not the same people. We were. I know that, Marcus said. But maybe we can figure out who we are now. That evening, Elizabeth retired early to the guest room Maria had prepared. Marcus sat on his front porch, smoking his pipe and looking out at the star-filled Texas sky. The events of the day felt surreal, like something from a dream or a novel. But Elizabeth was here in his house, alive and real. Whatever happened next, he was determined not to lose her again. This time he would fight for her. This time he would be the man she deserved. The next morning brought practical concerns. Elizabeth needed clothes more suitable for ranch life, and Marcus needed to address the questions that were sure to arise in town about his unusual purchase at the auction. I thought we might ride into town this morning, Marcus said over breakfast. Get you some proper clothes and supplies. Elizabeth nodded, though he could see the reluctance in her eyes. I'm not sure I'm ready to face all those people again. You don't have to face them alone, Marcus said. And Elizabeth, you have nothing to be ashamed of. What happened to you was not your fault. The trip to town was easier than either of them had expected. While there were certainly curious looks and whispered conversations, the people of Clearwater Creek were generally respectful. Mrs. Peterson at the general store was particularly kind, helping Elizabeth select practical clothes and asking no uncomfortable questions. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Tom Bradley approached Marcus tensed, expecting awkward questions about Elizabeth's status. Marcus, Tom said with the tip of his hat. Ma'am, Tom. Marcus replied carefully. I just wanted to say if you and the missus need anything, Mary and I are happy to help. Moving to a new place can be difficult. Marcus started to correct the assumption, then felt Elizabeth's hand on his arm. Thank you, Mr. Bradley, Elizabeth said. That's very kind. After Tom walked away, Marcus looked at Elizabeth questioningly. It's easier, she said simply. Let people think what they want to think. As the days passed, they fell into a comfortable routine. Elizabeth helped Maria with the household tasks. Though Marcus made it clear she was under no obligation to work, she seemed to find comfort in the familiar domestic activities, and gradually some of the tension left her shoulders. Marcus found himself looking forward to the evenings most of all. After dinner, they would sit on the porch and talk. Slowly, carefully, they began to share the experiences that had shaped their years apart. Elizabeth told him about her brief unhappy marriage, about the loneliness of widowhood, about the fear and desperation that had led to her current circumstances. Marcus, in turn, shared his struggles to build the ranch, the harsh early years when he had worked 18-hour days and slept in a one-room cabin. He told her about the cattle drives, the business dealings, the gradual accumulation of success that had brought him to his current position. You've become quite the businessman, Elizabeth observed one evening. The boy I knew was more interested in books than banking. I learned that survival required both. Marcus replied. But I've kept up with my reading. He took her to his study, a room lined with books from floor to ceiling. Elizabeth ran her fingers along the spines, noting the eclectic collection: literature, history, philosophy, agriculture, and business texts. I remember you reading poetry to me, she said, pulling out a volume of Tennyson. I remember that, too, Marcus said softly. They stood close together in the lamplight, and for a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. Then Elizabeth stepped back, the familiar weariness returning to her eyes. We're moving too fast, she said. Marcus nodded, though every instinct told him to pull her closer. I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. I feel it, too. But I need time to figure out who I am now before I can think about this. It was a reasonable request, and Marcus respected it. But as the weeks passed, he found his patience wearing thin, not with Elizabeth, but with the situation. He loved her, had never stopped loving her, and he could see in her eyes that she still had feelings for him. But she held herself back, and he couldn't blame her. The breakthrough came on a warm evening in late spring. Marcus had been working late in the study when he heard Elizabeth cry out. He rushed to her room, to find her sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said, embarrassed. "Bad dream." Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, his concern overriding propriety. "Do you want to talk about it?" Elizabeth shook her head, then changed her mind. It was about New Orleans. About what happened there. "Elizabeth, I haven't told you everything," she said, her voice barely audible. "About what I had to do to survive, about the things that were done to me." Marcus felt rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice gentle. "You don't have to tell me anything. You don't want to, but I do," Elizabeth said. "Because I need you to understand why I'm so afraid." She told him then about the months of degradation and fear, about the men who had seen her as nothing more than property to be used. She told him about the auction block in New Orleans, about the hands that had touched her without permission, about the constant fear that had become her daily companion. "I'm not the innocent girl you remember," she said when she finished. "I'm damaged goods, Marcus. Broken." Marcus took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder times. "You're not broken," he said firmly. "You're a survivor. You're the strongest person I've ever known. How can you say that after everything I've told you? Because none of it was your choice. Because you endured it and came out the other side. Because you're here now and you're still Elizabeth." She looked at him with wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "You really mean that?" "I've never meant anything more in my life." That night, something shifted between them. Elizabeth didn't leave her room, and Marcus didn't ask her to, but the wall she had built around her heart developed its first crack. Summer brought the busy season on the ranch. The cattle drive to market was successful, and Marcus found himself in better financial shape than he had been in years. He used some of the profit to make improvements to the house, including a new kitchen that delighted Maria and a sitting room that became Elizabeth's favorite place to sew and read. Elizabeth had begun helping with the ranch books. Her education and natural intelligence, making her invaluable in managing the business side of the operation. She had a head for numbers and a talent for organization that impressed Marcus and saved him considerable time. "You should be my partner," Marcus said one evening as they went over the ledgers together. "I think I already am," Elizabeth replied with a smile. It was the truth. Over the months, Elizabeth had become integral to the ranch's operation. She managed the household, helped with the books, and had even begun corresponding with potential buyers for the next year's cattle drive. She was in every way that mattered, except legally the lady of the house. The question of marriage hung between them like morning mist, present but unspoken. Marcus wanted to ask, had been wanting to ask for months, but he was afraid of pushing too hard. Elizabeth had come so far from the frightened woman on the auction block, but he could still see the weariness in her eyes sometimes. The decision, when it came, was Elizabeth's. It was a warm September evening and they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Elizabeth had been unusually quiet all day and Marcus could sense she had something on her mind. "Marcus," she said finally. "I've been thinking about what? About us? About this?" She gestured toward the house, the ranch, the life they had built together. About what we're doing here. Marcus felt his heart begin to race. And what conclusion have you reached? Elizabeth turned to face him. Her green eyes serious. I love you. I've loved you for 12 years, even when I thought I hated you. Even when I thought you had abandoned me, Elizabeth, let me finish. She said, I love you, and I think you love me. We're good together. Marcus. We work well as partners. We're comfortable with each other. But Marcus. Sensed there was more. But I need to know that you understand who I am now. Not who I was, but who I am. I'm not the innocent plantation belle you fell in love with. I'm a woman who has seen the worst of what people can do to each other. I'm harder now, more careful. I may never be able to give you children. I don't know what the years have done to me. I come with scars, Marcus. Visible. And invisible. Marcus stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the land he had carved from the wilderness. I fell in love with Elizabeth Hartwell when I was 20 years old, he said. But I'm not 20 anymore and she's not the woman standing behind me now. Elizabeth's face fell and Marcus realized his words had been misunderstood. What I mean, he said quickly, turning back to her, is that I fell in love with your spirit, your intelligence, your strength. Those things haven't changed. They've only grown stronger. He knelt down beside her chair, taking her hands in his. I don't want the girl you were. I want the woman you've become. Scars and all, hard times. And all. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, not with some memory of what we used to be. Elizabeth surged. His face, looking for any sign of doubt or reservation. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. She leaned forward and kissed him then, softly at first, then with growing passion. It was their first real kiss since their reunion, and it tasted of forgiveness and hope, and the promise of better days ahead. Yes, she whispered against his lips. Yes, what? Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll be your partner in all of this. Yes, I'll take the risk of loving you completely. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the local church. The entire town turned out. Partly out of genuine good wishes and partly out of curiosity about the couple whose love story had already begun to take on legendary proportions in the local gossip. Elizabeth wore a simple white dress that Maria had helped her sew with wildflowers in her hair that Marcus had picked that morning. Tom Bradley served as best man and Mrs. Peterson from the general store stood as matron of honor. The ceremony was brief, but meaningful. When Pastor Williams asked if anyone had objections to the union, the church was silent except for the sound of Elizabeth's quiet laughter. What's funny? Marcus whispered. I was just thinking about how we got here, Elizabeth whispered back. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I would be standing in a Texas church marrying the man I thought was lost forever. Do you regret it? Never, Elizabeth said. Firmly. Not for a single moment. The reception was held in the church hall, with most of the town contributing food and drink. Marcus found himself amazed at how quickly Elizabeth had been accepted into the community. Her natural grace and intelligence had won over even the most skeptical townspeople. As the evening wound down, Marcus and Elizabeth prepared to leave for their ranch. They had decided against a traditional honeymoon trip, preferring to begin their married life in the home they had built together. Mrs. Thornfield, Marcus said as he helped her into the wagon. I like the sound of that, Elizabeth replied. The ride home was peaceful with a full moon lighting their way. When they arrived at the ranch, Marcus surprised Elizabeth by carrying her across the threshold despite her laughing protest that they were too old for such nonsense. Some traditions are worth keeping, Marcus said as he sat her down in the front hall. That night, they came together as husband and wife with a passion that had been building for months. There was tenderness in their love-making, but also a sense of reclaiming something that had been stolen from them. They were no longer the young people who had loved in secret all those years ago, but they were something better. Two people who had survived loss and hardship and found their way back to each other. Afterward, as they lay in the darkness of their bedroom, Elizabeth traced patterns on Marcus' chest with her fingertip. "I used to dream about this," she said softly. "About what?" "About being here with you, about having a real home, a real life. I dreamed about it even when I was sure it would never happen." Marcus pulled her closer. "It's happening now. We're here. We're together. And nothing is ever going to separate us again. Promise me, Elizabeth," said, and he could hear the fear in her voice, the fear of someone who had lost everything once and couldn't bear to lose it again. "I promise," Marcus said solemnly. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." As autumn turned to winter, they settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Elizabeth threw herself into her role as ranch wife with the same determination she had shown in surviving her ordeal. She expanded the vegetable garden, organized the ranch hands more efficiently, and even learned to ride the more challenging horses. Marcus found himself happier than he had ever been. Coming home each evening to Elizabeth, sharing meals and conversation, and the quiet intimacy of married life felt like a gift he had never dared to hope for. The first test of their marriage came in December when a severe winter storm hit the area. For 3 days, they were snowed in at the ranch, unable to check on the cattle or get to town for supplies. The cold was bitter and they had to ration their food carefully. On the second day, Elizabeth came down with a fever as she lay shivering in their bed. Marcus was transported back to the lies her father had told about her death from fever. He stayed by her side, cooling her forehead with damp cloths and forcing her to drink water even when she didn't want to. "I'm not going to die," Elizabeth said weakly, seeing the fear in his eyes. "I know," Marcus said, though his voice shook. "I survived much worse than this," she reminded him. "I'm not going anywhere." She was right. By the third day, her fever had broken, and by the time the storm passed, she was weak, but recovering. Marcus realized that his fear had been less about her illness and more about his own ability to lose her again. "I can't go through that again," he admitted to her as she recovered. "You won't have to," Elizabeth said firmly. "I'm stronger than I look, Marcus. I'm stronger than either of us realized." Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant. News that filled them both with excitement and terror. Given her age and history, it would not be an easy pregnancy. But their joy outweighed their fears. "Are you ready to be a father?" Elizabeth asked one evening as they sat on the porch, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I'm ready for anything as long as you're with me," Marcus replied. The pregnancy was indeed difficult. Elizabeth suffered from morning sickness well into her second trimester, and the heat of the Texas summer was particularly hard on her, but she remained determined and optimistic, even when the local doctor expressed concerns about her age and health. "Women have been having babies for thousands of years," Elizabeth told Marcus when he worried. "I'm not going to be the first one to fail at it." Their son was born on a crisp October morning in 1848. After a long and difficult labor, Marcus paced the floor outside their bedroom while Maria and the doctor attended to Elizabeth. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he thought his heart might burst from relief and joy. "You have a son," Maria announced, opening the door with a smile. Marcus entered the room to find Elizabeth exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of her own quilts. The baby was small but healthy, with Elizabeth's green eyes and Marcus's dark hair. "What should we call him?" Elizabeth asked. They had discussed names for months but never settled on one. Now looking at his son's face, Marcus knew. "Thomas," he said, "after my grandfather, Thomas Hartwell." "Thornfield." Elizabeth smiled. "I like that. Tom Bradley will be pleased to have a namesake." Little Thomas proved to be a healthy, happy baby who brought even more joy to their already blessed household. Elizabeth took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, and Marcus discovered that fatherhood suited him well. The ranch continued to prosper. Marcus' reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle grew throughout Texas, and he began to receive offers from buyers as far away as California. Elizabeth's business acumen proved invaluable in negotiating these deals and managing the ranch's growing financial complexity. On their second wedding anniversary, Marcus surprised Elizabeth with a gift, a formal portrait painted by an artist from Austin. It showed the three of them on the front porch of their home with the ranch stretching out behind them. "I wanted to capture this moment," Marcus explained, "so that no matter what happens in the future, we'll always remember how happy we were right now." Elizabeth studied the portrait carefully. "We look like we belong here," she said with wonder. "We do belong here," Marcus said. "This is our home, our life, our family." As Thomas grew from baby to toddler, he brought new adventures and challenges. He was a curious, active child who kept both parents on their toes. Elizabeth proved to be a patient but firm mother, while Marcus discovered that he enjoyed nothing more than teaching his son about the ranch and the land. The boy's first word was horse, which delighted Marcus to no end. By the time he was 2, Thomas was already showing signs of being a natural horseman, fearlessly climbing onto the gentlest mare in the stable. "He's going to be a rancher," Marcus said proudly. "He's going to be whatever he wants to be," Elizabeth corrected. "But yes, I think he has his father's love of the land." Their happiness was occasionally shadowed by reminders of the past. Sometimes Elizabeth would wake from nightmares about her time in New Orleans, and Marcus would hold her until the trembling stopped. These episodes became less frequent as the years passed, but they never entirely disappeared. One evening in the spring of 1851, as they sat watching Thomas play with a wooden horse Marcus had carved for him, Elizabeth brought up a subject they had avoided for years. "I want to go back to Mississippi," she said quietly. Marcus looked at her in surprise. "Why?" "I need to see my father's grave. I need to make peace with what happened." Marcus understood. Elizabeth had carried the weight of her father's betrayal for years. And while she had found happiness with Marcus, she had never found closure. "We'll go together," Marcus said. "All of us." The journey to Mississippi took 2 weeks by wagon and riverboat. Thomas, now 3 years old, was fascinated by everything he saw, treating the trip as a grand adventure. Elizabeth grew quieter as they traveled east. The familiar landscape awakening memories both sweet and bitter. The plantation where Elizabeth had grown up was now owned by strangers. The new owners were polite but distant when the Thornfield family came to call. Elizabeth walked through the house where she had been born, touching walls and door frames as if trying to recapture something lost. "It's smaller than I remembered," she told Marcus. "Or maybe you've grown bigger," he replied. They found her father's grave in the family cemetery behind the old house. The headstone was simple. Colonel James Hartwell, 1785. 1846. There was no mention of his wife, who had died when Elizabeth was young, or his daughter, who he had claimed was dead. Elizabeth stood at the grave for a long time, with Marcus and Thomas waiting quietly nearby. Finally, she spoke. "I forgive you, Father," she said to the weathered stone. "I don't understand what you did or why you did it, but I forgive you, and I want you to know that I'm happy. Despite everything, I found my way to happiness." They also visited the grave that bore Elizabeth's name. The elaborate headstone her father had commissioned to support his lie. Elizabeth laughed when she saw it, a sound with no humor in it. "Here lies Elizabeth Hartwell," she read aloud. "Beloved daughter taken too soon. Well, I suppose that's true in a way. Elizabeth Hartwell did die. She died the day her father sold her future for his own peace of mind. But Elizabeth Thornfield was born," Marcus said, taking her hand. "And she's very much alive." The trip served its purpose. Elizabeth returned to Texas with a lighter heart. Having finally laid the ghosts of her past to rest, she threw herself into ranch life with renewed energy, taking on even more responsibility as Marcus' business grew. In 1852, they welcomed their second child, a daughter they named Grace. Unlike Thomas's difficult birth, Grace arrived easily and quickly, almost as if she were eager to join the family. She had her father's dark eyes, but her mother's delicate features. And from the beginning, she showed signs of having Elizabeth's strong will. 2 children. Elizabeth marveled as she nursed Grace while Thomas played at their feet. "A few years ago, I thought I would die alone and forgotten. Now look at us. God has been good to us," Marcus agreed. The ranch now employed 12 men full-time, and Marcus had begun buying land from neighboring ranchers who were ready to move on or sell out. The Thornfield spread now covered nearly 10,000 acres, making it one of the largest operations in the county. With success came new responsibilities and new challenges. Marcus found himself drawn into local politics, serving on the town council, and helping to plan improvements to Clearwater Creek. Elizabeth became active in the church and the newly formed Ladies' Auxiliary, using her education and social skills to benefit the growing community. Thomas started school in town when he turned 6, riding in each morning with Marcus and staying with the Petersons until evening. He was a bright child who excelled at reading and arithmetic, though his teachers often complained that he would rather discuss cattle and horses than literature and history. "He's going to be a rancher," Marcus said again, watching his son demonstrate his writing skills to his little sister. "Maybe," Elizabeth said. "But I want him to have choices. I want both of them to have choices." The conversation about their children's futures became more pressing as the political situation in Texas grew more complicated. Talk of secession was in the air, and Marcus found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the state seemed to be heading. "We built something good here," he told Elizabeth one evening as they discussed the political situation. "I don't want to see it torn apart by war." "Do you think it will come to that?" Elizabeth asked. Marcus nodded grimly. "I'm afraid it will. And when it does, we'll have to decide where we stand." The decision when it came was easier than either of them had expected in 1861 when Texas seceded from the Union. Marcus refused to take an oath of loyalty to the Confederacy. It was a position that put him at odds with many of his neighbors and cost him some business relationships. "Why?" Tom Bradley asked, during a heated town meeting. "You're a Texan now, Marcus. This is your home." "This is my home," Marcus agreed. "But I won't support a cause built on the backs of human bondage. I've seen what that system does to people. I won't be part of it." Some in the crowd muttered angrily, but Elizabeth stood up from the back of the room. "My husband speaks for both of us," she said clearly. "We've seen enough of buying and selling human beings. We want no part of a war fought to preserve that practice." Her words Carried extra weight because everyone in town knew her story by now. The woman who had been sold at auction had become one of the most respected members of their community, and her opposition to slavery carried moral authority that was hard to dispute. The war years were difficult for the Thornfield family. Marcus lost several business relationships and faced occasional harassment from Confederate sympathizers, but he also gained new respect from those who admired his principled stand. More importantly, the family remained together and prospered. Even during the hardest times, Marcus' reputation for honesty and fair dealing served him well when others were struggling to find buyers for their cattle. Union forces in nearby states were always in need of beef, and Marcus found ways to get his herds to market despite the challenges. Thomas, now a teenager, threw himself into ranch work with enthusiasm. He had grown tall and strong with his father's steady hands and his mother's quick mind. Grace, though only 10, was already showing signs of being a formidable young woman, equally comfortable in the saddle or the schoolroom. "They're good children," Elizabeth said one evening as they watched Thomas teaching Grace to rope a fence post. "They are," Marcus agreed. "We've been blessed." The war ended in 1865 and Texas began the difficult process of rebuilding and reunification. Marcus found himself in demand as a voice of moderation and reconciliation. He served on committees to help former slaves transition to freedom and worked to rebuild trade relationships with northern buyers. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had become something of a local celebrity. Her story, the woman sold at auction who became a successful rancher's wife, had spread throughout Texas and beyond. She received letters from women across the country who had heard her story and found inspiration in it. "I never expected to become a symbol," Elizabeth told Marcus after receiving another letter from a woman in Kansas who had escaped slavery. "You were always a symbol to me," Marcus replied. "A symbol of strength and courage and the power of love to overcome any obstacle." In 1867, Thomas announced his intention to attend college in Austin. It was a decision that pleased Elizabeth, but worried Marcus. "The ranch needs you," Marcus told his son. "The ranch will still be here when I graduate," Thomas replied, "but Mother is right. I need to have choices. I want to learn about business and law, maybe even engineering. I want to bring new ideas back to the ranch." Marcus realized his son was right. The world was changing, and successful ranching would require more than just knowledge of cattle and horses. With some reluctance, he agreed to send Thomas to the University of Texas. Grace, now 15, had become her mother's closest companion and confidant. She was an excellent student who spoke fluent Spanish and showed a talent for mathematics that impressed even the men who did business with the ranch. "She's going to college, too," Elizabeth announced one day. "Women don't go to college," Marcus protested. "Automatically. Some women do," Elizabeth said firmly. "And Grace is going to be one of them. We have the money and she has the brains. I won't have my daughter limited by other people's expectations." The conversation echoed one they had had years earlier about choices and opportunities. Marcus realized that Elizabeth was determined to ensure their children had options she had never had. "All right," he said. "Finally. But where? Most colleges don't accept women. There are some that do. We'll find one." True to her word, Elizabeth researched women's colleges and eventually found one in Massachusetts that would accept Grace. It meant their daughter would be far from home, but Elizabeth was adamant. "I want her to see the world beyond Texas," Elizabeth explained. "I want her to know there are opportunities out there, choices to be made." In 1870, they sent both children east to school. Thomas to the University of Texas and Grace to Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in Massachusetts. The house felt empty without their laughter and energy. But Marcus and Elizabeth found themselves rediscovering each other in the quiet. "It's like a second honeymoon," Elizabeth said one evening as they sat on the porch enjoying the peace after years of busy family life. "Are you sorry they're gone?" Marcus asked. "I miss them terribly," Elizabeth admitted. "But I'm proud of them, too. They're going to have opportunities we never dreamed of." The 1870s brought new prosperity to the Thornfield Ranch. The railroad had finally reached their part of Texas, making it much easier to get cattle to market. Marcus invested in new breeding stock and improved facilities, and the ranch's reputation for quality beef spread throughout the Southwest. Elizabeth had become the unofficial business manager of the operation, handling correspondence, contracts, and financial planning. She had a gift for negotiation that surprised many of the men she dealt with, and her reputation for honesty and shrewd dealing grew alongside Marcus. Thomas returned from college in 1871 with a degree in business, and a headful of new ideas. He immediately threw himself into modernizing the ranch's operations, introducing new breeding techniques and improved record keeping. "You've done well, son," Marcus told him after reviewing Thomas's first quarterly report. "I learned from the best," Thomas replied. "Both of you." Grace remained in Massachusetts for 4 years, earning not just her education, but also a reputation as a brilliant student and gifted writer. Her letters home were filled with descriptions of the wider world and her dreams for the future. When she finally returned to Texas in 1874, she was a poised young woman of 22 with definite ideas about her future. She had no intention of simply marrying the first suitable man her parents approved of. "I want to write," she announced. "Books, newspaper articles, maybe even magazine pieces. There are stories that need to be told, and I want to be the one to tell them." Elizabeth smiled, remembering her own younger self and the dreams that had been deferred but never entirely abandoned. "Then you should write," she said simply. Grace's first published piece was a story about her mother's experiences written for a women's magazine in New York. The article, titled "From Auction Block to Ranch House, One Woman's Journey to Freedom," created a sensation and led to requests for more stories. "I hope you don't mind," Grace told her mother after the article was published. "I thought people should know what really happened." "I don't mind," Elizabeth said. "If our story can help other people, then I'm glad you told it." The article did help other people. Elizabeth began receiving letters from women across the country who had faced their own hardships and found inspiration in her story. Some were former slaves who had gained their freedom after the war. Others were widows or divorcees trying to rebuild their lives. Marcus watched with pride as his wife answered each letter personally, offering encouragement and practical advice. She had become, without seeking it, a voice for women who had been knocked down by life but refused to stay down. In 1875, Thomas married Mary Catherine Bradley, Tom Bradley's daughter. It was a love match that pleased both families, and the wedding was the social event of the year in Clearwater Creek. Elizabeth looked beautiful in her mother-of-the-groom dress, and Marcus beamed with pride as he watched his son pledge his life to the young woman he loved. "Do you remember our wedding?" Elizabeth asked Marcus as they danced at the reception. "Every detail," Marcus replied. "Though I think Thomas and Mary Catherine are handling it with more grace than we did. We were older," Elizabeth pointed out. "We had more to overcome." Thomas and Mary Catherine settled into a house Marcus built for them on the ranch property. Within a year, they had presented Marcus and Elizabeth with their first grandchild, a boy they named James Marcus Thornfield. "Grandfather suits you," Elizabeth told Marcus as she watched him teaching little James to identify different types of cattle. "And grandmother suits you," Marcus replied. watching Elizabeth rock the baby while humming an old lullaby. Grace, meanwhile, had established herself as a successful writer. Her stories about life on the frontier were published in magazines throughout the East, and she was working on her first novel. She had also become something of a spokesperson for women's rights, writing articles about education and opportunity. She's making a name for herself, Marcus said proudly. She's making her own way, Elizabeth corrected. Which is exactly what I hoped she would do. The ranch now employed over 30 men and covered 15,000 acres. Marcus had become one of the most successful ranchers in Texas, and his operation was studied and emulated throughout the West. But success had not changed him. He still treated his workers fairly and was known for his integrity in all his business dealings. Elizabeth, now in her 50s, had grown into a woman of considerable influence in her own right. She served on the boards of the church and the school, and her opinions on community matters carried significant weight. She had also become something of a mentor to younger women, offering advice and support to those facing their own challenges. In 1878, Marcus surprised Elizabeth with a trip to California. They traveled by train, a luxury that still amazed them both. The journey took them through landscapes they had never seen, and they spent 2 weeks exploring San Francisco and the surrounding area. It's beautiful, Elizabeth said as they stood on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. But it's not home, Marcus observed. No, Elizabeth agreed. Texas is home. The ranch is home. Our family is there. They returned to Texas, refreshed and renewed, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They were in their 50s now. No longer young, but still vigorous and engaged with life. The 1880s brought new changes and new challenges. The open range was disappearing as more land was fenced and settled. Marcus adapted by buying more land and improving his breeding programs. The Thornfield Ranch became known throughout the Southwest for its high-quality cattle and innovative ranching techniques. Thomas had taken over much of the day-to-day management of the ranch, allowing Marcus to focus on the bigger picture of business development and land acquisition. Father and son worked well together, combining Marcus' experience with Thomas's education and new ideas. Grace had married in 1880, choosing a newspaper editor from Austin named William Crawford. It was a partnership of equals, two intelligent, ambitious people who supported each other's careers. Grace continued to write under her maiden name and had published her first novel to considerable acclaim. I'm proud of both our children, Elizabeth told Marcus one evening as they read Grace's latest article about women's education. They turned out well despite having us for parents, Marcus joked. They turned out well because of having us for parents, Elizabeth corrected. We gave them love, support, and the freedom to choose their own paths. As the 1880s drew to a close, Marcus and Elizabeth found themselves grandparents to 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, who filled the ranch house with laughter and energy whenever they visited. Marcus had built a swing on the front porch specifically for his grandchildren, and Elizabeth had taught each of them to read before they started school. We've had a good life, Elizabeth said one evening as they watched the sunset from their favorite spot on the porch. The best life, Marcus agreed. Better than I ever dared to hope for. Do you ever think about that day at the auction? Elizabeth asked. About how different things could have been. Marcus considered the question sometimes, but I think we were meant to find each other again. Maybe not the way it happened, but somehow. I used to think I was cursed, Elizabeth said, all those years of hardship and loss, but now I think maybe I was just being prepared for this, for you, for our family, for the life we built together. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. 41 years had passed since that morning in 1847 when Marcus had dropped to his knees in the dust of a Texas town square. 41 years of building a life together, of overcoming obstacles, of creating something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The ranch spread out before them in the darkness. Thousands of acres of Texas grassland that had become their kingdom. The house behind them was filled with the accumulation of decades. Furniture they had chosen together. Books they had read, photographs of their children and grandchildren. No regrets? Marcus asked. None? Elizabeth said firmly. Not about the hard times because they led us here. Not about the choices we made because they were the right ones. Not about growing old together because it's better than growing old apart. Marcus reached for her hand, still amazed after all these years by the simple miracle of her presence beside him. I love you, Elizabeth Thornfield. I love you too, Marcus. Always and forever. As they rose to go inside, Elizabeth paused for one last look at the land they had claimed and tamed and made their own. Somewhere in the distance, cattle loaded softly in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new reasons to be grateful for the life they had built together. But tonight, they were simply Marcus and Elizabeth. Husband and wife, partners in all things, two people who had found their way back to each other against impossible odds and created something eternal from their love. The auction had been 41 years ago, but in all the ways that mattered, their real life had begun. The moment Marcus dropped to his knees and recognized the woman he thought he had lost forever. Everything else, the ranch, the success, the family, had grown from that moment of recognition and the love that had survived separation, hardship, and time itself. They had come so far from that dusty town square. But in another sense, they had simply come home. Now that you've watched the full story, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your thoughts help us improve and ensure we're bringing you the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy.